If you think a boarding pass is enough to prove you belong in first class, you've never seen how fast a system can decide otherwise. At Gate 14 of Horizon Atlantic Airways inside Chicago O'Hare International Airport, the morning looked ordinary, almost routine, the kind of controlled chaos travelers accept without question: rolling suitcases, overhead announcements, coffee cups in paper sleeves, and the distant hum of engines preparing for departure. But that illusion of normalcy would not survive what was about to happen. A man stepped into the boarding lane wearing a simple dark jacket, jeans, and clean white sneakers, carrying nothing that screamed importance: no entourage, no designer luggage tags, no visible markers of status. His name was Jordan Carter, 42 years old, unassuming in appearance. But behind that calm exterior was a man who had spent years building systems most people in this terminal depended on without ever knowing his name. Today, however, he was not here as an executive, not here as a board member, but as a test. A quiet experiment in how people treat someone they believe has no power. At the counter stood Richard Hayes, gate supervisor, a man who had worked airport operations long enough to believe he could read a passenger in under 5 seconds. Beside him, 2 flight attendants reviewed boarding lists while glancing occasionally at Jordan with subtle skepticism, the kind that never needs words to be understood. When Jordan presented his boarding pass, Richard barely looked at it before exhaling sharply, tapping the screen twice as if correcting an inconvenience rather than verifying a ticket. "This section is for priority boarding only," Richard said flatly, his tone carrying the kind of authority that does not invite discussion. Jordan didn't react immediately. He simply observed the moment. The way people shift when they think they are in control, the way confidence can sometimes mask assumption. Behind him, passengers slowed their pace, sensing tension but not yet understanding its source. A young flight attendant named Emily Brooks glanced at the system display again, her expression tightening for just a second as she noticed something unusual in the clearance tag attached to his reservation, a hidden marker most staff never bothered to question. She opened her mouth slightly, then hesitated, as if deciding whether speaking would change anything. Richard, however, had already made his judgment. "Sir, you'll need to step aside. This section is reserved for confirmed first-class priority passengers." The words landed cleanly, rehearsed, final. Jordan looked toward the aircraft through the glass tunnel, then back at the gate agent, not with anger, not with surprise, but with a quiet understanding that something familiar was unfolding again. The kind of moment he had seen before, in different cities, in different buildings, always wearing different uniforms but carrying the same underlying assumption. Around them, the airport kept moving, unaware that a single interaction at Gate 14 was about to test far more than etiquette or procedure. It was about to test what happens when people confuse appearance with access and access with power. And Jordan Carter, still standing in line like any other passenger, was about to see exactly how far that confusion would go. The moment Richard Hayes finished speaking, the air around Gate 14 shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible at first, like a pressure change before a storm fully arrives. Jordan Carter did not move immediately, not because he was uncertain, but because he was observing how quickly a simple statement could turn into a system of exclusion. Behind the counter, Richard adjusted his posture, signaling to himself that the situation was under control, while the nearby flight attendants exchanged brief glances that carried more doubt than confidence. One of them leaned slightly toward the terminal screen, rechecking the boarding status, her eyes narrowing as she noticed a clearance designation that did not match the assumptions being made out loud. Emily Brooks, standing closest to the display, saw it clearly now, a restricted priority tag embedded deeper in the system layer, labeled with a level she had only read about during training but never seen activated in real operations. Her fingers hesitated above the keyboard, caught between procedure and intuition. Richard, unaware of what she was seeing, gestured toward the side of the gate area. "Sir, if you could please step aside. We need to continue boarding for verified first-class passengers." His tone remained controlled, but it carried something heavier underneath, an assumption that compliance would come without question. Jordan finally spoke, his voice steady and low, not challenging, not defensive, simply present. "I am exactly where my ticket confirms I should be." The sentence did not raise tension, it clarified it. Behind him, A passenger shifted slightly, pulling out a phone, beginning to record without fully understanding why the moment felt different. Emily took a quiet breath and leaned toward Richard, lowering her voice. The system shows a full clearance match. It is not standard priority. It is higher. Richard glanced at her quickly, irritation flashing across his expression. We follow boarding protocol, not anomalies, he replied, dismissing her input without looking at the screen again. That was when Jordan stepped half a pace forward, just enough to re-enter the center of attention without raising his voice. Then you should verify the anomaly before you escalate the mistake, he said calmly. The words were not loud, but they carried weight, and that weight began to spread through the small crowd forming behind him. A second passenger whispered to another that something about this did not feel routine. Emily's hand now rested fully on the terminal console, and this time she did not hesitate. She accessed the deeper verification layer, her eyes scanning until the designation appeared again, clearer now, confirming executive-level override authorization tied to a restricted operational account. Her breath caught slightly as the realization formed, but before she could speak, Richard moved to signal security support, still operating under the belief that he was resolving an inconvenience. Jordan watched the exchange quietly, then lowered his gaze briefly to his phone, sending a single message with minimal movement. On the other end of that message, unseen and distant from the terminal chaos, a system began to register his presence across multiple nodes. Emily noticed the first subtle shift in the gate interface, a brief flicker of synchronization status, changing from pinning to active, and in that moment, she understood that whatever was about to happen was no longer controlled by the gate staff in front of her. Jordan looked up again, his expression unchanged, and the surrounding noise of boarding announcements and rolling luggage seemed to fade slightly, as if the system itself was waiting for a command that had already been prepared long before anyone at Gate 14 realized it existed. The atmosphere at Gate 14 continued to tighten, as if the space itself was adjusting to something unseen, something not yet acknowledged by the people standing in it. Richard Hayes stepped slightly away from the counter, reaching for his communication device with controlled urgency, his confidence shifting into something more procedural as he attempted to escalate what he still believed was a boarding irregularity. Behind him, the boarding line slowed without instruction, passengers sensing that the rhythm of departure had been interrupted for reasons no one had fully explained. Emily Brooks remained fixed on the terminal screen, her attention no longer divided, because the designation she had discovered was now responding in real time, shifting from a static record to an active status confirmation that she had never seen deployed at a live gate before. The words on the interface refreshed once, then again, as if a deeper system was verifying itself against an internal authority layer. Richard spoke into his device, requesting security presence at Gate 14, his tone measured but increasingly firm, signaling to everyone around him that escalation was now in motion. Jordan Carter stood in the same position he had occupied since the beginning, neither resisting nor complying in the way people expected, but instead maintaining a calm stillness that made the surrounding tension feel even more pronounced. A nearby passenger lowered their voice while recording, unsure whether they were witnessing a mistake or a breakdown in procedure, but certain that something unusual was unfolding. Emily finally spoke, her voice careful but direct, addressing Richard without looking away from the screen. The clearance is not just valid, she said. It is actively synchronizing with system authority control. Richard frowned, dismissing her words as misinterpretation, but the terminal behind her responded again, this time with a subtle visual shift as boarding permissions momentarily paused for all first-class processing. That pause was not part of any standard airport operation. Jordan glanced toward the boarding tunnel where passengers had begun to slow, noticing the change in flow, then returned his attention to the gate staff with a quiet expression that revealed no urgency. This is the point where verification should have already happened, he said calmly, his voice steady enough that it cut through the surrounding noise without effort. Emily hesitated, then leaned closer to the console and initiated a secondary authentication sequence, her hands moving carefully now as she followed a protocol that was not typically used during active boarding unless instructed by higher operational command. On the screen, a new label appeared, briefly unclassified, then resolved into a structured authorization tier that caused her expression to shift from uncertainty to recognition. She stepped back slightly, realizing that the system was not correcting an error, but confirming a hierarchy. Richard noticed her reaction and demanded clarification, but before she could answer, the boarding system across multiple gates flickered in unison, causing a brief ripple of delay notifications to appear on overhead monitors. Jordan's phone remained in his hand, unmoving, but the subtle connection between his presence and the system response was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Somewhere deeper in the airport network, a sequence had begun to execute, not loud enough to be visible, not dramatic enough to announce itself, but structured enough to begin altering the flow of operations. Emily finally looked up from the screen toward Jordan, her voice lowered as she spoke the first words that hinted at understanding rather than confusion. This level of access should not be active at a passenger gate, she said quietly, and in that moment, the environment around Gate 14 seemed to pause between one state of reality and another, as if waiting for the next instruction that would determine what the entire terminal believed was happening next. The moment Emily Brooks stepped back from the terminal screen, the entire rhythm of Gate 14 shifted again, not through sound or movement, but through a subtle reordering of control that no longer felt like something localized to a single boarding counter. Overhead displays that normally cycled through departures and gate assignments began to hesitate between updates, holding for fractions of a second longer than usual before refreshing. Richard Hayes noticed it first as a delay in confirmation feedback from his device, a pause that should not have existed in a system designed for real-time operations. He pressed the communication button again, requesting immediate assistance from airport security and operations support, his voice now carrying a sharper edge of urgency as he attempted to reassert structure over a situation that was slipping outside of standard protocol. Around him, passengers who had been waiting to board first class began to sense that something broader than a simple boarding dispute was unfolding, as the flow of movement toward the aircraft slowed without announcement. Jordan Carter remained in place, his posture unchanged, his attention steady, as if he were observing not just the people in front of him, but the entire invisible framework responding to his presence. Emily returned to the terminal interface, her expression now fully focused, and initiated a deeper system trace that required elevated permissions she rarely accessed. The screen responded with a sequence of authentication layers, each one resolving faster than the last, as though the system itself had already anticipated her request. What appeared next caused her to pause completely. A classification tag expanded across the display, not as an error or warning, but as a confirmation of authority routing that extended beyond gate operations into airline network governance. Richard turned toward her, demanding immediate explanation, but she did not answer right away. Instead, she read the information again, slower this time, verifying that what she was seeing was not a temporary system anomaly. "This is not passenger-level clearance," she said quietly, her voice losing its earlier hesitation. "This is operational authority integration." Richard frowned, stepping closer to the screen, insisting that the system must be misreading credentials or pulling outdated records. But even as he spoke, a second change rippled through the gate infrastructure. Boarding permissions for multiple flights across adjacent gates briefly entered a suspended state, triggering soft alerts on monitors that passengers could see but not yet understand. The airport environment, once defined by predictable sequencing, now carried a faint sense of interruption, as if multiple systems were waiting for a directive that had not come from the staff currently in control. Jordan finally took a slow step forward, closing the distance between himself and the counter just enough to be heard clearly without raising his voice. "The system is not failing," he said calmly. "It is confirming." His words were not delivered as a challenge, but as an observation, and that distinction unsettled the space more than confrontation would have. Emily looked toward him directly now, her understanding shifting from technical recognition to situational clarity. She realized that the access tier she was viewing was not designed for passenger interaction at all, but for governance-level override across operational flight control layers. Richard attempted once more to regain authority by calling for immediate escalation to supervisory staff, but his voice was now competing with alerts he could no longer fully interpret. Jordan's phone remained still in his hand, Yet somewhere deep within the airport network, synchronized responses continued to propagate outward beyond Gate 14. The boarding line behind them no longer advanced, not because it was stopped manually, but because the system governing movement had entered a conditional hold state across multiple departure sequences. Emily exhaled slowly, finally speaking what she had been avoiding acknowledging. If this continues to synchronize at this level, she said, it will not remain isolated to this gate. For the first time, Richard did not respond immediately, and in that brief silence the weight of the situation expanded beyond personnel, beyond procedure, and into the underlying infrastructure of the entire terminal operation, where something far larger was now actively aligning itself around a presence that had not yet revealed its full authority. The silence that followed Emily Brooks' last statement did not last long, but it changed the nature of everything that came after it. At Gate 14, the environment was no longer behaving like a normal boarding process. It was behaving like a system waiting for confirmation from a level above human instruction. Richard Hayes attempted once more to assert procedural control, but even his voice now carried uncertainty, as if he was no longer fully confident that the protocols he relied on were sufficient to explain what was unfolding. He raised his communication device and requested an immediate supervisory override, but the response he received was not the usual confirmation of assistance. Instead, there was a delay, followed by a system acknowledgement that did not route through local operations channels. That detail alone caused Emily to straighten slightly, her attention locked on the screen as she watched additional layers of clearance verification unfold without manual input. Jordan Carter remained still, but the stillness around him was no longer passive. It felt structured, as if his presence had already been registered across multiple operational tiers that extended far beyond the gate. Behind him, the boarding queue had fully stalled, passengers now standing in quiet confusion as overhead monitors displayed temporary suspension notices across multiple departures. Richard turned toward Jordan, his frustration no longer fully contained, and demanded clarity with a sharper tone than before, but the sound of his voice felt increasingly disconnected from the system response unfolding around them. Emily, still focused on the terminal, saw something new appear, a cascading authorization confirmation that expanded across airport network layers, linking gate operations, flight scheduling, and air traffic coordination nodes in a synchronized sequence she had never witnessed in active service. Her breath slowed as understanding replaced confusion, and she finally spoke again, not to Richard this time, but to the reality of what she was observing. "This is not a localized clearance event," she said quietly. "This is network-level synchronization." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Richard did not immediately dismiss them, because even he could now see that multiple independent systems were responding in alignment without input from gate personnel. At that moment, a subtle shift occurred in the broader airport flow, as if distant processes were beginning to adjust timing windows for departures and ground coordination. Jordan finally lifted his gaze toward the terminal display, then toward the boarding tunnel, where the aircraft stood ready but increasingly disconnected from standard boarding progression. "You are trying to resolve a surface issue," he said calmly, his voice steady and measured. "But the decision has already moved beyond this gate." The statement did not escalate tension, it clarified scale. Emily looked at him directly now, fully aware that what she was witnessing was not an anomaly, but an authorization hierarchy being activated in real time, one that did not require approval from the individuals currently attempting to manage it. Richard stepped back slightly, his earlier confidence replaced by the realization that control was no longer being negotiated at his level. Somewhere deeper in the airport system, a coordination protocol continued to expand outward, affecting scheduling logic across multiple terminals. The boarding process at Gate 14 remained frozen, not due to error, but due to structured override conditions that were still unfolding. Emily's voice lowered further as she spoke her final observation, directed more to herself than anyone else. "If this reaches full activation," she said, "it will not remain an airport-level event." And in that moment, the space around them felt less like a gate waiting for passengers, and more like a threshold between routine procedure and something far larger that had already begun to take control of its own execution path. The atmosphere at Gate 14 had reached a point where silence was no longer absence of sound, but the presence of something being held in suspension. Every system panel, every overhead display, and every boarding indicator across adjacent gates appeared to be waiting for a unified instruction that had not yet fully arrived. Emily Brooks stood motionless at the terminal, her eyes fixed on the layered authorization stream that continued to expand across operational channels. What she was seeing was no longer confined to a single gate interface. It had become a synchronized response across multiple airport management layers, each one acknowledging a form of clearance that did not belong to any standard passenger category. Richard Hayes attempted to reassert control by contacting Central Operations again, but the response he received was increasingly indirect, routed through higher authorization filters that bypassed local gate authority entirely. That shift alone changed his posture, because it confirmed that the situation was no longer being interpreted at his level of command. Jordan Carter remained in the same position, his presence steady, his expression unchanged, but the effect around him continued to expand in subtle but measurable ways. Boarding queues at nearby gates had slowed, departure notifications were temporarily paused, and automated coordination systems were adjusting timing windows without human input. Emily finally broke her silence again, her voice quieter now, as if speaking too loudly might interfere with what she was trying to understand. "This is not just synchronization anymore," she said. "It is authorization propagation across the network." Richard turned toward her sharply, but there was no anger in his expression anymore, only a growing recognition that what he had tried to frame as a boarding dispute had already moved beyond procedural correction. Jordan's gaze shifted briefly toward the aircraft visible through the terminal glass, then back to the gate interface. "At this stage," he said calmly, "you are not managing access. You are observing access already granted." His words did not elevate tension, they redefined it. Emily's hands moved carefully across the terminal console again, and what she found confirmed her earlier conclusion with even greater clarity. The authorization tier linked to Jordan's profile was not simply active. It was cascading through dependent systems, influencing scheduling logic, clearance timing, and operational sequencing across multiple departure zones. Richard stepped slightly back from the counter, his earlier attempts at escalation now replaced by silence, as he processed the implication that the control he relied on was no longer the controlling layer. In the distance, subtle changes in boarding announcements across other gates began to align in delayed synchronization, as if the entire terminal was adjusting to a central directive that had already been executed. Emily looked toward Jordan again, her voice now steady but cautious. "If this continues at this level," she said, "it will reach air traffic coordination interfaces." The statement did not carry speculation, it carried recognition. Jordan did not respond immediately. Instead, he observed the environment one more time, as though confirming that the system response matched the expectation he had initiated earlier. The space around Gate 14 no longer felt like a single point of conflict, but like a node inside a much larger operational structure that was quietly reorganizing itself in real time. Richard's communication device remained in his hand, but no further commands were issued, because the responses he was receiving no longer originated from a level he could influence. Emily finally lowered her gaze slightly, acknowledging what the system had already begun to demonstrate. Control was no longer being requested or denied, it was being reallocated. And in that realization, the distinction between a boarding gate and a global coordination system had begun to dissolve completely. The stillness that had settled over Gate 14 began to shift again, but this time it was not a delay or a hesitation in the system. It was a structured transition, as if a decision that had been forming across multiple layers of infrastructure was now reaching its final execution state. Emily Brooks watched the terminal interface closely, her focus narrowing as new authorization signals propagated across the network with unmistakable consistency. What had previously appeared as isolated synchronization events was now aligning into a unified operational directive spanning gate control, scheduling logic, and higher-level coordination systems. Richard Hayes no longer attempted to issue commands through his device. The responses he had been receiving earlier had stopped acknowledging his input entirely, replaced instead by system acknowledgements routed through external authorization channels that bypassed local control structures. The realization settled into his expression slowly, not as panic, but as the recognition of a boundary he could no longer cross. Jordan Carter remained composed, his posture unchanged, but the environment around him had reached a point of full alignment, where every operational layer appeared to be responding to a single confirmed authority state. Emily's voice lowered as she studied the final authentication layer that had just appeared on the terminal. "This is no longer in coordination mode," she said carefully. "It is an execution confirmation." Richard turned toward her, but did not interrupt, because even he could now see that boarding processes across multiple gates had entered a synchronized hold, with departure sequences pausing in precise alignment rather than random delay. Overhead monitors displayed system messages that no longer referenced individual gates, but entire terminal segments under temporary operational reconfiguration. Jordan finally spoke again, his voice steady and calm, carrying no urgency, only finality. "What you are observing now is not escalation," he said. "It is resolution of authorization hierarchy." Emily looked at him directly, her understanding now fully formed, not as speculation, but as confirmation of what the system itself was reflecting back. The clearance designation associated with Jordan's profile was not simply elevated. It was foundational, tied to governance-level permissions that extended beyond airline operations into network coordination authority. Richard stepped slightly back from the counter, his earlier authority now replaced by a quiet acceptance that the framework he operated within was no longer the highest applicable layer in this situation. In the distance, boarding announcements across adjacent gates had stopped entirely, replaced by automated notices indicating temporary suspension pending centralized operational review. Passengers who had been waiting no longer asked questions, as the change in environment had removed the expectation of normal progression. Emily exhaled slowly, her eyes still on the screen as the final confirmation sequence completed its cycle. "All dependent systems are now acknowledging override alignment," she said quietly. Jordan did not react to the statement. Instead, he observed the terminal one final time, as if confirming that the system response matched the intention already in motion before any of them had become aware of it. Richard's communication device remained inactive in his hand, no longer producing responses that reflected local authority. The space at Gate 14 felt no longer like a point of conflict, but like a transition node where operational control had already been transferred beyond visible structure. Emily finally stepped slightly away from the terminal, her voice almost a whisper now. "This is not a boarding gate anymore," she said. "It is part of something much larger now." And in that moment, the distinction between airport procedure and system-wide governance had fully dissolved, leaving only the quiet confirmation that whatever had been activated had already completed its ascent beyond anything the people present were still trying to interpret. The moment the terminal interface at Gate 14 completed its final synchronization cycle, the environment shifted from anticipation into confirmation, as if every system connected to the airport network had reached the same conclusion at the same time. Emily Brooks observed the change first in the disappearance of pending status indicators across multiple screens, replaced by unified operational acknowledgements that no longer referenced individual gates, but entire coordinated sectors of the airport. Richard Hayes, still standing near the counter, slowly lowered his communication device, realizing that no further escalation requests would return meaningful responses from the channels he had relied on only minutes earlier. The network was no longer reacting to local input. It was operating under a consolidated directive that had already been accepted across higher system layers. Jordan Carter remained in place, his expression unchanged, but the space around him now reflected complete structural alignment, as boarding processes, flight sequencing, and terminal operations had all entered a controlled pause state, pending centralized resolution. Emily stepped slightly away from the terminal, her voice now calm but precise as she interpreted the final system status. "All dependent systems have completed authorization confirmation," she said quietly. "There are no remaining local override paths active." Richard looked toward her but did not respond immediately, because the implication of her words had already manifested physically across the terminal, where boarding queues had fully stopped and departure displays showed synchronized operational hold notices across multiple gates. Passengers who had been waiting no longer attempted to ask questions, as the atmosphere itself had shifted into a state of controlled stillness, where movement felt suspended by design rather than disruption. Jordan finally broke his silence, speaking with the same steady tone that had accompanied every previous moment of escalation. "What you are seeing now is not interruption," he said. "It is system completion." Emily looked toward him directly, her understanding now fully settled, no longer searching for technical explanation, but acknowledging structural reality. The clearance architecture associated with him was no longer acting as a reactive authorization layer. It had transitioned into an active governance state that influenced operational continuity across the airport network. Richard took a slow step back from the counter, his earlier authority fully dissolved into observation, as he recognized that every attempt to assert control had already been absorbed into a higher decision framework that no longer required gate-level validation. In the distance, airport staff across adjacent gates stood still, watching their own systems reflect identical status confirmations, each one indicating temporary operational stabilization under centralized directive control. Emily spoke one final time, her voice low and steady, as if documenting what she knew would define the moment in retrospect. "This level of activation does not revert through standard procedure," she said. "It resolves only when the initiating authority releases it." Jordan did not move, did not announce anything further, and did not engage with the surrounding reactions. Instead, he simply observed the now stabilized environment, where the entire operational structure had shifted from uncertainty into alignment. And in that quiet confirmation, Gate 14 ceased to function as a point of disruption, becoming instead a resolved node within a fully synchronized system that had already completed its transition into a new operational state. The stillness that had settled across the airport after the final synchronization did not feel like an ending, but like a transition into a new operational reality that no longer required interpretation from the people standing at Gate 14. Emily Brooks remained near the terminal interface, her attention fixed on the final status confirmations that had stabilized across all visible systems. What she saw now was not movement, not escalation, and not error correction, but a completed state acknowledgement that extended across the airport's operational network. Every dependent process had aligned under a single resolved authorization layer, and no further local inputs were being accepted as controlling factors. Richard Hayes stood silently near the counter, his earlier attempts at communication fully abandoned, as the devices he relied on no longer produced responses that reflected his authority level. Around them, the boarding area had transformed into a controlled pause state, where passengers remained, still not out of instruction, but because the system itself had suspended all forward progression. Jordan Carter finally shifted his gaze from the terminal to the surrounding environment, observing the results of the activation he had initiated without visible effort or announcement. Emily spoke softly, her voice now carrying the weight of final confirmation rather than analysis. "All operational layers have stabilized under unified authorization control," she said. "There is no further segmentation between gate-level and system-level authority." Richard looked toward her, but the expression on his face had already moved beyond confusion, settling instead into recognition that his role in the process had concluded. Jordan's voice followed calmly, steady and unchanged from the beginning. "What has been resolved here is not an incident," he said. "It is a correction of access hierarchy." The words did not create reaction in the same way earlier statements had. Instead, they confirmed what the environment had already demonstrated. Emily lowered her gaze briefly, understanding now that what she had witnessed was not a temporary override, but a structural realignment that affected the entire operational framework of the airport network. In the distance, systems across multiple terminals displayed identical stabilization messages, indicating synchronized operational continuity under centralized directive authority. No further alerts were generated, and no additional escalation channels remained active at the local level. Richard stepped slightly away from the counter, his presence no longer aligned with decision-making but with observation, as though he had become a witness to a process that no longer required his participation. The boarding queues remained motionless, not because they were blocked, but because movement had been temporarily redefined by the system itself. Emily finally spoke once more, her tone quiet and definitive. "This does not reset through standard procedure," she said. "It only resolves when the initiating authority closes the cycle." Jordan did not respond. Instead, he remained still, observing the now fully stabilized environment where every operational layer had aligned under a single completed state. The airport around Gate 14 no longer reflected disruption or conflict, but the aftermath of a system that had already finished reorganizing itself at every level. And in that silence, the distinction between control and observation disappeared completely.